They called us amateurs. They laughed at our planes. But we had the last laugh. Let me tell you how it happened. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean on a morning that would forever change the course of aerial warfare. In the early days of World War II, Japanese pilots soared through the skies with an arrogance born from countless victories. They had dominated the air above China, humiliated colonial powers in Southeast Asia, and struck a devastating blow at Pearl Harbor. Their Zero fighters seemed invincible, dancing through the clouds with a grace and agility that left American pilots struggling to keep up. In their cockpits, these Japanese aviators laughed at the lumbering American planes, mocking the pilots who flew them as amateurs playing at war. They believed themselves to be samurai of the sky, inheritors of an ancient warrior tradition, blessed by divine wind and destined for eternal glory. But pride, as the old saying goes, comes before a fall. What these confident pilots did not realize was that across the vast Pacific, in hangars and briefing rooms scattered across American bases, a transformation was taking place. American pilots were learning, adapting, evolving. They were studying every engagement, analyzing every loss, and developing tactics that would turn the tables on their overconfident enemies. This is the story of how mockery turned to respect, how laughter became silence, and how the hunters became the hunted in the deadly skies above the Pacific Theater. Asterisk. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero entered the war as perhaps the most advanced carrier-based fighter aircraft in the world. When it first appeared in the skies over China in 1940, it shocked everyone who encountered it. The Zero could outclimb, outmaneuver, and outrange virtually any opponent. Its design philosophy emphasized agility and range above all else, creating an aircraft that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and then engage in dogfights with a level of maneuverability that seemed almost supernatural to those who faced it. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya stood beside his Zero on the deck of the carrier Akagi in the Praju darkness of December 7, 1941. He had painted 43 small flags on the side of his cockpit, each representing a confirmed kill over China. As he performed his pre-flight checks, he spoke to the younger pilots gathering around him. "You will see today how the Americans fight," he told them with a slight smile. "They are big and slow, like their country. They build heavy planes because they do not understand that in the sky, grace defeats power. They will lumber toward us like bears, and we will dance around them like hornets. Remember your training. Remember that you carry the spirit of Japan in your heart. Today we will show them what real pilots can do." The attack on Pearl Harbor went exactly as the Japanese had planned. American fighters that managed to get airborne were quickly dispatched by the superior Zeros, the few P-40 Warhawks. And P-36 Hawks that rose to meet the attackers found themselves completely outmatched. The Zeros could turn inside them, climb faster, and maintain energy in ways the American planes simply could not match. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers that day with stories of easy victories, of American planes falling from the sky like wounded birds, of pilots who seemed barely trained in aerial combat. In the months that followed, this pattern repeated across the Pacific. In the Philippines, American and Filipino pilots flying outdated P-35s and P-26 P-shooters were slaughtered by Japanese Zeros. At Darwin, Australia, the same story unfolded. Over Burma and the Dutch East Indies, Allied pilots faced the grim reality that they were flying inferior aircraft against superbly trained opponents who had honed their skills in years of combat over China. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai became one of the most vocal in his contempt for American pilots. After a mission over the Philippines in January 1942, he gathered with fellow pilots in the ready room of his carrier. "I shot down 3 today," he announced, barely able to contain his amusement. "The last one tried to turn with me. Can you imagine? A P-40 trying to turn with a zero. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He tried to dive away, but even in a dive, he was so slow. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. If this is the quality of American pilots, this war will be over by summer. Other pilots laughed and shared similar stories. They spoke of American formations that broke apart at the first sign of combat, of pilots who seemed to panic when engaged, of tactics that appeared to come straight from training manuals, with no adaptation to actual combat conditions. The Japanese had spent years fighting in China, developing their skills against Chinese pilots, who themselves had been trained by Soviet instructors. They had learned to work as teams, to execute complex maneuvers in perfect coordination, to press attacks, with a ferocity that terrified their opponents. But what the Japanese pilots interpreted as American incompetence was actually something else, entirely. The United States had entered the war with a relatively small cadre of experienced combat pilots. Most American aviators in the Pacific during those early months had never fired their guns in anger, had never felt the adrenaline surge of actual combat, had never experienced the disorientation of a high-speed dogfight. They were flying older aircraft, using outdated tactics, against an enemy that had every advantage. Captain Colin Kelly became one of the first American pilots to earn respect from the Japanese, though he paid for it with his life. On December 10, 1941, Kelly piloted a B-17 bomber in an attack against Japanese ships off the Philippines. Despite being swarmed by Zeros, Kelly held his aircraft steady, allowing his bombardier to make an attack run. His bomber was shot down, but he stayed at the controls long enough for his crew to bail out. When news of his sacrifice reached Japan, some of the more thoughtful Japanese pilots began to wonder if perhaps they had underestimated the American spirit, even if the American equipment and training left much to be desired. Lieutenant Nishizawa, another ace with dozens of victories, expressed this sentiment to his squadron mates one evening. "The Americans are brave enough," he admitted. "I will give them that. They do not run, even when they should. But bravery without skill is just another word for suicide. Their planes are heavy and clumsy. Their tactics are predictable. They fly in rigid formations that make them easy targets. Most importantly, they do not understand energy management. They waste their speed in useless maneuvers. They try to turn with us when they should dive or climb. They are learning the hard way, and in war, learning the hard way means dying." The Japanese success extended beyond just fighter combat. Their bomber pilots, escorted by the seemingly invincible Zeros, struck targets across the Pacific with impunity. The American attempt to hold the Philippines crumbled under relentless Japanese air attacks. General Douglas MacArthur was forced to flee to Australia, leaving behind thousands of American and Filipino troops who would eventually surrender it. Bataan and Corregidor. In the air bases and carrier-ready rooms of the Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, confidence grew into arrogance. Pilots began to take unnecessary risks, secure in the belief that no American pilot could touch them. They would break formation to pursue individual targets. They would extend chases beyond prudent limits. They would mock their opponents over the radio, knowing that Americans monitoring Japanese frequencies would hear their contempt. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the principal architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, grew concerned about this growing overconfidence. He gathered his pilots one evening in March 1942 and delivered a stern warning. "You have all tasted victory," he told them. "You have all added to your scores. But I want you to remember that the Americans are not fools. They are learning from every engagement. They are analyzing our tactics. Most importantly, they are building new aircraft and training new pilots at a pace we cannot match. Today, you may shoot down 3 or 4 Americans and return safely. But what about tomorrow? What about next month? What about next year? Do not let your early victories blind you to the reality that this war is far from over. Asterisk, but Genda's warning fell. Largely on deaf ears, the victories kept coming. At the Battle of the Java Sea, Japanese aircraft devastated Allied naval forces. Over Burma, the famous Flying Tigers led by Claire Chennault managed to achieve some success using hit-and-run tactics, but even they could not stop the Japanese advance. Rangoon fell, Singapore fell, the Dutch East Indies fell, and everywhere, Japanese pilots returned with stories of American planes falling from the sky. Asterisk, the mockery extended beyond just combat reports. Japanese propaganda broadcasts featured Tokyo Rose taunting American pilots, calling them cowards and incompetents. Japanese newspapers published cartoons showing Zeros as graceful samurai and American fighters as clumsy brutes. Some Japanese pilots even adopted the practice of taking photographs of the American planes they shot down, collecting these images like trophies. Asterisk, yet even in these early dark days, there were signs that the situation was not as hopeless as it appeared. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, American pilots fighting from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown managed to turn back a Japanese invasion force heading for Port Moresby. For the first time, a Japanese offensive had been stopped. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku. More importantly, the carrier Zuikaku lost so many aircraft and experienced pilots that it would be out of action for months. Asterisk. The American pilots who fought at Coral Sea were still flying inferior aircraft. Their Grumman F-4F Wildcats were slower and less maneuverable than the Zero, but they were beginning to learn. They were starting to understand that they could not fight the Zero on its terms. Some pilots began experimenting with new tactics, using the Wildcat's superior diving speed and ruggedness to their advantage. They learned to avoid turning dogfights and instead use slashing attacks, diving from above, firing a burst, and then using their speed to escape before the Zeros could bring their maneuverability to bear. Still, the overall picture remained grim. For the Americans, Japanese pilots continued to rack up impressive scores. The quality gap between Japanese and American pilots remained substantial. And the mockery continued. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. The journey from humiliation to triumph is just beginning, and you will not want to miss what happens next. Asterisk, the Battle of Midway in June 1942 would prove to be the moment when Japanese confidence began its long, painful transformation into something else entirely. The Japanese combined fleet approached the tiny atoll with overwhelming force, intending to destroy the remaining American carriers and establish dominance in the Central Pacific. Japanese pilots, veterans of 6 months of unbroken victory, prepared for what they assumed would be another easy triumph. Lieutenant Tomonaga led the first strike against Midway Island itself on the morning of June 4th. His bombers, escorted by Zeros, devastated American installations on the island. As he pulled away from the target, he radioed back to the carrier Hiryu. Installations destroyed. Recommend second strike. Minimal opposition encountered. Their fighters barely challenged us. The Americans are as weak here as they have been everywhere else. On the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, Japanese pilots lounged in their ready rooms, confident that the American carriers would soon be located and destroyed. Many had already painted additional victory markings on their aircraft in anticipation of the kills they expected to achieve. Some wrote letters home describing their inevitable triumph. Others simply slept, conserving energy for what they assumed would be a long day of aerial slaughter. But unknown to the Japanese, American codebreakers had given Admiral Nimitz the priceless gift of advance warning. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, waited in ambush northeast of Midway. And while the American pilots were still outmatched in terms of aircraft performance and experience, they possessed something the Japanese had not. Accounted for. They were fighting for survival, and they knew exactly where to find their enemy. The first American attacks were disasters that seemed to confirm every Japanese assumption about American incompetence. Torpedo bombers from all three. Carriers pressed home attacks with suicidal bravery and almost no fighter escort. The slow, lumbering Devastator torpedo bombers were torn apart by defending Zeros. Of 15 planes from Torpedo Squadron 8 off the Hornet, only one pilot survived. The Japanese pilots who slaughtered these brave men saw only confirmation of what they had believed all along. Flight Petty Officer Koshiro Yamashita shot down 3 torpedo bombers in rapid succession. As he lined up on a fourth, he felt almost bored. They come straight at us, he thought. No evasive maneuvers, no tactics. Just straight lines, perfect targets. This is not combat. This is execution. He fired another burst, and another American. Plane tumbled into the sea, trailing smoke and flame. But while the Zeros were busy at low altitude, destroying the torpedo bombers, something else was happening high above. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had found the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment. The Japanese flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for a strike against the American carriers. Fuel. Lines snaked across the decks. Bombs and torpedoes lay exposed. And the defending Zeros were all at sea level, too far away to intercept. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led his dive bombers down from 14,000 feet in a near-vertical attack that the Japanese never saw coming. The first bombs struck Akagi, Genda's flagship, penetrating the flight deck and detonating among the armed and fueled aircraft below. Within seconds, the ship was transformed into an inferno. More bombs hit Kaga and Soryu. All 3 carriers were mortally wounded in the span of 5 minutes. Japanese pilots returning from the strike on Midway Island stared in disbelief at the burning hulks that had been their homes. Some circled uselessly, low on fuel, with nowhere to land. Others ditched in the ocean, hoping to be picked up by destroyers. A few made it to the surviving carrier Hiryu, where they refueled and rearmed for a desperate counterattack. Lieutenant Tomonaga, despite being wounded and flying a damaged aircraft, led this counterattack against the Yorktown. His bombers and their Zero escorts fought through American fighter screens and anti-aircraft fire to land several bombs and torpedoes on the American carrier. But Tomonaga's aircraft, leaking fuel and damaged, never made it back. He crashed into the sea, becoming one of many Japanese pilots to die that day. In the late afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and reduced it to the same burning wreck as its sister ships. By sunset, 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the core of their naval aviation power, were sinking beneath the Pacific waves. With them went hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and crew, men who had trained for years and could not be quickly replaced. The surviving Japanese pilots who made it back to the remaining ships in the fleet were stunned into silence. The mockery was gone. The jokes were gone. The contempt was gone. In its place was a growing realization that perhaps they had fundamentally misunderstood their enemy. Flight Petty Officer Sakai, who survived Midway, later wrote about the shock that pervaded the fleet. "We had thought ourselves invincible," he recorded. "We had won every battle, dominated every engagement. But in one day, everything changed. We lost 4 carriers. We lost hundreds of pilots and crew. We lost the initiative. And we lost something else, something harder to quantify. We lost our certainty. For the first time since the war began, we understood that we could lose. That the Americans, for all their apparent clumsiness and inexperience, could hurt us, could defeat us. But the American victory at Midway, decisive as it was did not immediately translate into air superiority. The Japanese still had more experienced pilots, still had the Zero with its superior maneuverability, still had the advantages of years of combat experience. The losses at Midway were severe, but Japan still possessed formidable air power scattered across the Pacific. What Midway did accomplish was to stop Japanese expansion and force them onto the defensive. It also gave American pilots a crucial psychological boost. They had faced the best the Japanese had to offer and emerged victorious. Yes, they had suffered terrible losses. Yes, many brave men had died in obsolete aircraft. But they had won. The Japanese were not invincible. Their carriers could burn. Their pilots could die. Their advance could be stopped. In the aftermath of Midway, both sides began to reassess their situations. The Japanese recognized that they needed to conserve their experienced pilots, to be more careful, to take fewer risks. But they were slow to change their tactics or their training programs. They still believed that superior skill and spirit would ultimately prevail over American material advantages. The Americans, meanwhile, accelerated their already massive industrial mobilization. New carriers were being built at an astonishing pace. New aircraft were rolling off assembly lines in ever-increasing numbers. And most importantly, new pilots were being trained using lessons learned from every combat engagement. The Americans were institutionalizing their learning, creating a system where knowledge from the front lines was rapidly incorporated into training programs back home. In August 1942, the United States invaded Guadalcanal, beginning a brutal 6-month campaign that would prove to be the real crucible where American pilots would forge themselves into a force capable of defeating the Japanese. The skies over Guadalcanal and the surrounding waters would become known as the slot, a killing ground where dozens of air battles would rage, where hundreds of aircraft would fall, and where the balance of power would inexorably shift. Asterisk the first. American pilots to arrive at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal were a mixed bag of Marine, Navy, and eventually Army Air Force squadrons flying a variety of aircraft. They faced daily attacks by Japanese bombers escorted by Zeros flying down from Rabaul. The Japanese came with clockwork regularity, so predictable that the Americans nicknamed the daily raids the Tokyo Express. Major John L. Smith led one of the first Marine fighter squadrons to defend Henderson Field. His pilots, flying Wildcats, were still outmatched by the Zero in terms of aircraft performance. But they were learning. They were developing tactics. And most importantly, they were getting combat experience at a rapid rate. A pilot who survived a week over Guadalcanal learned more than a pilot training stateside for 6 months. The Japanese pilots who flew the missions too. Guadalcanal quickly discovered that the Americans they faced over the Solomons were different from the Americans they had fought earlier in the war. These pilots did not make the same mistakes. They did not try to turn with Zeros. They used altitude and teamwork. They covered each other. They fought with a determination and skill that surprised the overconfident Japanese aviators. Lieutenant Nishizawa, now one of Japan's leading aces, found himself in an extended dogfight with a Wildcat pilot who refused to be baited into making mistakes. The American stayed fast, stayed high when possible, and used his wingmen effectively. Nishizawa eventually shot him down, but it took far longer than it should have, and he expended far more ammunition than he liked. When he landed back at Rabaul, he gathered his squadron mates. "The Americans are improving," he told them flatly. "This pilot I fought today knew what he was doing. He understood the limitations of his aircraft and fought within them. He used good tactics. If he had been flying a Zero instead of a Wildcat, I am not certain I would have won that engagement." His fellow pilots were skeptical. "You are too modest." "Nishizawa," one of them said, "you are one of our best." One American pilot, getting lucky, does not mean they have suddenly become skilled. But Nishizawa shook his head. It was not one lucky pilot. I have been seeing this change gradually over the past weeks. They are learning. They are adapting. And we need to take them seriously, or we will pay the price. The grinding attritional battles over Guadalcanal continued through the fall of 1942. Both sides lost aircraft and pilots at unsustainable rates. But there was a crucial difference. The Americans could replace their losses. New pilots arrived regularly. New aircraft were ferried in. When a plane was damaged, parts were available to repair it. When a pilot was lost, another took his place within days. The Japanese, by contrast, were stretched thin. Their pilots flew long missions from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back, often at the edge of their fuel range. When they lost pilots, replacements were slow in coming and often less experienced than the men they replaced. When aircraft were damaged, parts were scarce. The attrition was slowly bleeding Japanese naval aviation white, but the full extent of the damage would not become apparent until later. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. The transformation from mockery to desperation is accelerating, and the most dramatic changes are yet to come. Asterisk, while the Japanese clung to their belief in superior fighting spirit and the capabilities of the Zero, American pilots and engineers were methodically solving the problems that had plagued them since the war began. The transformation happened on multiple fronts simultaneously. New aircraft, new tactics, better training, and a growing corps of experienced combat veterans who knew how to fight Zeros and win. The arrival of new American fighters marked the beginning of the end for Japanese air superiority. The Vought F-4U Corsair began appearing in combat in February 1943, and it was a revelation. With its powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the Corsair could outrun, outdive, and outclimb the Zero. It carried 650 caliber machine guns, with enough firepower to tear a Zero apart with a single burst. And most importantly, it was rugged enough to absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero and keep flying. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin-engine design and concentrated nose armament, proved particularly effective in the Pacific. Its long range made it ideal for escort missions and fighter sweeps. Its speed and climb rate gave it performance advantages over the Zero, and in the hands of skilled pilots, it became a deadly weapon. But perhaps most important was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, specifically designed with input from combat pilots who had fought Zeros. The Hellcat was everything a carrier fighter needed to be. It was fast, heavily armed, well-armored, and easy to fly. It could not outturn a Zero, but it did not need to. It could outperform the Zero in virtually every other metric that mattered in combat. Lieutenant Alex Vrachu, who would become one of America's leading aces, described his first flight in a Hellcat. The difference between the Wildcat and the GT Hellcat was like the difference between a freight train and a sports car, he said. In the Wildcat, I always felt like I was fighting at a disadvantage, like I had to be twice as smart and twice as careful as the Japanese pilot to survive. In the Hellcat, I felt like I had a fighting chance. I could choose when to engage and when to disengage. I could dictate the terms of the fight. It was a game changer. But new aircraft alone would not have been enough without the tactical evolution that accompanied them. American pilots, learning from every engagement, developed a system of mutual support that became known as the Thatch Weave, named after Commander John Thatch, who pioneered it. The Thatch Weave involved two fighters flying in coordination, weaving back and forth so that any enemy attacking one would find himself crossing in front of the other. It was simple, effective, and deadly. The tactics expanded beyond just defensive maneuvers. American pilots learned to use boom and zoom attacks, diving from altitude with a speed advantage, firing a quick burst, and then climbing away before the more maneuverable Zero could bring its turn radius to bear. They learned to work in teams, with multiple fighters coordinating attacks to overwhelm individual Japanese planes. They learned to use altitude as their friend, staying high where American aircraft had performance advantages. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley institutionalized these lessons in training programs. Every pilot who joined his squadron received intensive instruction in energy management, mutual support tactics, and the specific techniques needed to fight Zeros effectively. Do not try to turn with them, he hammered into his students. Do not. Hit slow, stay fast, stay high, and use your wingman. The Zero is a magnificent aircraft in a turning fight, but we will not give them a turning fight. We will give them a fight on our terms. Meanwhile, the quality of American pilot training was improving dramatically. The massive training infrastructure that the United States had built was now producing pilots at an incredible rate. More importantly, combat veterans were rotating back to training commands, bringing with them hard-won lessons from the front lines. A student pilot in late 1943 learned tactics that had been proven effective just weeks earlier over the Solomons or New Guinea. The Japanese, by contrast, kept their experienced pilots in combat until they were killed or injured. Japanese training programs did not incorporate lessons from the front as effectively. New Japanese pilots arrived at the front with impressive aerobatic skills, but often with little practical knowledge of actual combat tactics. They were being fed into a meat grinder, and the quality of Japanese naval aviation was declining even as the quality of American naval aviation was rising. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942 illustrated both the continued skill of Japanese pilots and the growing effectiveness of American defenders. Japanese carrier aircraft managed to sink the carrier Hornet and damage Enterprise, but the cost was staggering. Japan lost over 100 aircraft and pilots, including many experienced veterans. The Americans also lost heavily, but they could afford it. Japan could not dot by mid-1943. The mockery that Japanese pilots had once directed at their American opponents had completely vanished. In its place was a growing respect tinged with fear. Reports from Japanese pilots returning from combat missions over the Solomons and New Guinea painted a grim picture. The Americans are no longer easy prey, one report stated. They fly better aircraft, use effective tactics, and fight with great skill and determination. Our losses are mounting. Flight Petty Officer Sakai, now scarred from a wound that had cost him the sight in one eye, fought over the Solomons through much of 1943. He watched as the tide inexorably turned against Japan. The Americans just keep coming, he told a fellow pilot. We shoot down 5 and 10 more appear. They have new pilots, fresh aircraft, full ammunition loads. We are down to our last experienced men. Our aircraft are worn out, and we never have enough fuel or ammunition. How do you win a war like that? The question had no good answer. Japan's industrial capacity could not match America's. Japan's training pipeline could not replace losses as quickly as they were occurring. And Japan's strategic situation was deteriorating as American forces island hopped across the Pacific, establishing new airfields ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The arrival of the P-38 Lightning in the Pacific Theater brought another capability that terrified Japanese pilots: the ability to escort bombers all the way to their targets and back. The long-range P-38s could fly missions that previously would have been impossible for single-engine fighters. This meant that American bombers, previously vulnerable to Japanese interception, now arrived over their targets with swarms of escort fighters. On April 18, 1943, American P-38s demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most skilled Japanese pilots. Based on intelligence indicating the travel plans of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's most respected naval commander, American P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron flew a long-range interception mission. They caught Yamamoto's transport aircraft and escort fighters over Bougainville and shot them down. The death of Yamamoto was a devastating blow to Japanese morale and a clear demonstration that American pilots had evolved from the amateurs they had mocked just 18 months earlier. The pilots who flew that mission, including future ace Rex Barber, had executed a precision operation that required exact navigation over hundreds of miles of ocean, careful fuel management, and the skill to overwhelm the defending Zeros before they could protect their charge. It was a far cry from the panicked, disorganized American efforts of early 1942. As 1943 progressed, American carrier task forces began conducting offensive operations against Japanese-held islands. The carrier raids on Marcus Island, Wake Island, and Tarawa demonstrated that the Americans now possessed the capability to strike anywhere in the Pacific with overwhelming force. Japanese defenders watched helplessly as waves of Hellcats, Corsairs, and dive bombers attacked their positions, while Japanese fighters were either destroyed on the ground or overwhelmed in the air. The Great Marianas Turkey shoot in June 1944 would prove to be the final nail in the coffin of Japanese naval aviation. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American carrier-based fighters defended the fleet against massive Japanese air attacks. The result was a slaughter. American pilots shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft over 2 days while losing fewer than 30 of their own. The Japanese attacks were so ineffective and the American victory so one-sided that American pilots referred to it as a turkey shoot. Lieutenant Alexander Vryu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement during the battle. His victory was not unusual. Many American pilots scored multiple kills. The Japanese, by contrast, accomplished almost nothing. Their attacks were uncoordinated, their pilots inexperienced, and their tactics outdated. The new Japanese pilots, rushed through abbreviated training programs, stood no chance against battle-hardened American veterans flying superior aircraft. Japanese pilot who survived the Philippine Sea battle later described the experience as a nightmare. "We flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire," he said. "American fighters were everywhere. They were faster than us, better armed, and they flew in coordinated teams. We were scattered, confused, and overwhelmed. I saw aircraft falling all around me. I fired at one American fighter and saw my bullets bounce off his armor. He turned and destroyed my wingman with a single burst. I ran. I am not ashamed to say it. I ran because to stay was to die for nothing." The contempt that Japanese pilots had once felt for their American opponents had been completely reversed. Now it was American pilots who spoke dismissively of Japanese aerial capabilities. Now it was Americans who racked up impressive scores. Now it was Japanese pilots who returned from missions shaken and demoralized, if they returned at all. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. The final chapter of this transformation awaits, and it is both tragic and inevitable. By late 1944, the situation for Japanese naval aviation had deteriorated beyond repair. The combination of catastrophic losses in the Philippine Sea, the grinding attrition of daily combat, and the complete inability to replace lost pilots with adequately trained replacements had reduced Japanese air power to a shadow of its former self. The pilots who had once mocked American fighters were now mostly dead, their places taken by barely trained teenagers who had no chance of survival against the American juggernaut. The Japanese Navy, desperate to find some way to inflict meaningful losses on the American fleet, turned to a tactic that would have been unthinkable in the confident days of 1941 and 1942. Kamikaze attacks. The very existence of the kamikaze program was an admission that Japan could no longer compete in conventional aerial combat. If Japanese pilots could not defeat American fighters in dogfights, could not penetrate American fleet defenses with conventional attacks, then perhaps they could at least damage American ships by turning their aircraft into guided missiles, sacrificing themselves in suicide attacks. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi organized the first kamikaze units in October 1944. He gathered young pilots, some with as little as 50 hours of total flight time, and told them they would have the honor of serving as living weapons. You will strike a blow against the American invaders that will echo through history, he told them. Your sacrifice will inspire the nation. Your deaths will have meaning. But the reality of the kamikaze program was far less noble than the rhetoric suggested. It was a symptom of desperation, a tacit acknowledgement that Japanese pilots could no longer compete with American pilots in aerial combat. The young men who volunteered, or were voluntold, for kamikaze missions did so not out of genuine desire, but out of social pressure, cultural conditioning, and the absence of any alternative. They knew they were being sent to die because their leadership had failed, because their training was inadequate, and because their nation was losing a war it should never have started. Lieutenant Junior Grade Yukio Seki led the first organized kamikaze attack against American ships off Leyte Gulf on October 25, 1944. His small formation of Zeros, each loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb, dove on the escort carrier St. Lo and succeeded in sinking it. The attack was deemed a success by Japanese commanders, who immediately ordered more kamikaze missions. What they did not acknowledge was that of the 5 aircraft in Seki's formation, only his struck its target. The other 4 were shot down by American fighters or anti-aircraft fire before they could complete their attacks, found themselves in the grim position of shooting down aircraft that were trying to crash into ships rather than engage in conventional combat. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy who sought death rather than victory was profound. Ensign Doan Lewis, flying a Hellcat off the carrier Essex, described intercepting a kamikaze formation. They were not trying to evade us, he said. They were not maneuvering. They just kept flying straight toward the fleet. We shot them down one after another. Some of them were so inexperienced they could barely keep their aircraft level. It was not combat. It was slaughter. And I felt sorry for them. These kids who had been sent out to die by commanders who had run out of options and ideas. The kamikaze attacks continued through the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Thousands of young Japanese pilots dove their aircraft into American ships, achieving some successes, but at a horrific cost. American defenses improved rapidly, with fighter patrols, radar picket ships, and dense anti-aircraft fire, creating a layered defense that destroyed most kamikaze before they reached their targets. The exchange ratio was devastatingly one-sided. Japan was trading thousands of pilots and aircraft for relatively minor damage to the American fleet. The few remaining experienced Japanese pilots watched this transformation with a mixture of horror and resignation. Flight Petty Officer Sakai, who had survived the entire war, refused orders to join a kamikaze unit. I have fought the Americans for 4 years, he told his commanding officer. I have seen us go from victory to defeat, but I will not throw my life away in a gesture that accomplishes nothing. If you order me to fly a kamikaze mission, I will take off, drop my bomb in the ocean, and shoot down as many American aircraft as I can before they get me. At least that way my death might mean something. Sakai's defiance was rare. Most pilots, conditioned by years of military indoctrination and cultural pressure to obey orders without question, flew their kamikaze missions as commanded. But even these young pilots knew the truth. One kamikaze pilot wrote in his diary before his final mission, "We are told we are divine wind that will drive away the invaders. But I think we are just young men who are going to die because our leaders made mistakes and will not admit them. I do not want to die, but I do not know how to refuse. So I will fly tomorrow, and I will aim my aircraft at an American ship, and I will die. And perhaps someone someday will remember that I did not want this." The American pilots who had once been mocked by their Japanese opponents now found themselves in the strange position of pitying the enemy they destroyed. The dogfights that had once been contests between skilled opponents had devolved into one-sided massacres. American pilots would intercept formations of Japanese aircraft and find themselves facing pilots who barely knew how to fly, let alone fight. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Afterward, he expressed no joy in the victory. "They were helpless," he said quietly. "Most of them flew straight and level. A few tried to maneuver, but their movements were uncoordinated and clumsy. It reminded me of shooting clay pigeons at a range, except these pigeons were human beings. Boys, really, who had been given a few weeks of training and sent out to die. This is not the way war should be. This is not honorable combat between equals. This is just killing, and it makes me sick." The technological gap had also widened beyond recognition. By 1945, the Americans were flying aircraft that represented a quantum leap beyond what had been available in 1941. The F-4U Corsair, continuously upgraded throughout the war, could reach speeds of over 400 miles per hour. The F-6F Hellcat had been refined to near perfection. And new aircraft like the F-8F Bearcat were arriving that could outperform the Zero in literally every measurable category. The Japanese, meanwhile, were still primarily flying variations of the Zero, an aircraft designed in the late 1930s. Attempts to develop new fighters like the Kawanishi N-1K2, J. Shigenkai showed promise but arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a difference. Most Japanese pilots in 1945 were flying worn-out Zeros with engines that were overdue for overhaul, using fuel of such poor quality that it reduced performance, and carrying ammunition that often malfunctioned. The Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 represented the largest kamikaze effort of the war. Over 1,500 kamikaze sorties were flown against the American fleet supporting the invasion. The attack succeeded in sinking dozens of smaller ships and damaging several larger vessels, but the strategic impact was negligible. The invasion proceeded, the island fell, and Japan lost another 1,500 pilots and aircraft it could not replace. American fighter pilots flew combat air patrols over the fleet from dawn to dusk, intercepting wave after wave of kamikaze attacks. The missions were exhausting and psychologically draining. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia led a division of Hellcat pilots that developed tactics specifically for countering kamikaze attacks. "We called it the mowing machine," he explained. "We would position ourselves between the incoming kamikazes and the fleet, then work as a team to destroy them systematically. One division could sometimes shoot down 20 or more aircraft in a single engagement, but there was no satisfaction in it. We were killing desperate men in obsolete aircraft. It was necessary, but it was not glorious." The contrast between Japanese and American pilot quality had become almost absurd. American pilots completing training in 1945 received over 600 hours of flight time before being sent to the front, including extensive gunnery practice, aerobatics, instrument training, and tactical instruction. Japanese pilots in the same period were lucky to receive 100 hours of training, most of it just basic flight instruction. Many kamikaze pilots had never fired their guns, never practiced combat maneuvers, never even flown at night or in bad weather. Institutional knowledge that the United States had built over 4 years of war was staggering. Training manuals incorporated lessons from thousands of combat engagements. Instructors were often combat veterans with dozens of missions under their belts. Aircraft were equipped with gun cameras so that every combat engagement could be analyzed and learned from. Mistakes that might have been repeated in 1942 were identified and corrected by 1945. Japan, having kept its experienced pilots in combat until they died, had lost nearly all of its institutional knowledge. The few veterans who survived, men like Sakai, were treated with suspicion because their survival suggested cowardice to a military culture that venerated death in combat. The lessons they could have taught new pilots were often ignored or dismissed. The tactics that might have given Japanese pilots a fighting chance were not passed down because there was no effective system for doing so. By the summer of 1945, American carrier task forces were operating off the coast of Japan itself, launching strikes against Japanese airfields and industrial targets with impunity. Japanese fighters rose to meet these attacks and were slaughtered. On a single day in July 1945, American carrier aircraft destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft, most of them caught on the ground or shot down during takeoff. American losses for the entire day totaled fewer than 10 aircraft, most lost anti-aircraft. Fire rather than enemy fighters. The psychological transformation was complete. Japanese pilots who had once spoken with contempt about American aviators now spoke with dread. American pilots who had once struggled to survive against superior Japanese opponents now flew their missions with the confidence of men who knew they possessed overwhelming advantages in training, equipment, and tactics. A young Japanese pilot, captured after being shot down near Yokosuka in August 1945, was interviewed by American intelligence officers. They asked him what he thought of American pilots. He laughed bitterly. "What do I think? I think you are professionals, and we are sacrifices. I think you have spent years learning your craft, while we have spent weeks. I think you fly aircraft designed with the lessons of 4 years of war, while we fly aircraft designed before the war started. I think you work as teams while we fly as individuals. I think you want to win and survive while we are expected to die. That is what I think." The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, could be launched. This likely saved the lives of thousands of American pilots who would have flown missions over Japan during the invasion. It also saved the lives of thousands of Japanese pilots who would have been sent up in kamikaze attacks or conventional missions that had no hope of success. When the war ended, American pilots had achieved a kill ratio of over 12 to 1 against Japanese aircraft. The best American aces had scores in the 20s and 30s. The Japanese ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who had survived the war to become Japan's top scorer with over 80 confirmed kills, was killed in October 1944 when the transport aircraft carrying him was shot down by American fighters. His death was symbolic. Even the best Japanese pilot could not survive in the new environment where American aircraft, American tactics, and American pilots dominated the skies. In the years after the war, Japanese pilots who had survived reflected on the transformation they had witnessed. Sakai, who wrote extensively about his experiences, acknowledged the hubris that had infected Japanese naval aviation in the early days of the war. "We believed we were invincible," he wrote. "We believed that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that our training and skill would always be superior. We were wrong. The Americans proved to be quick learners, adaptable, and willing to change tactics when something was not working. Most importantly, they built a system that could produce quality pilots in large numbers and equip them with excellent aircraft. We did not, and that made all the difference. American pilots, for their part, remembered the fear they had felt in the early days of the war when facing the Zero and its skilled pilots. They remembered the losses, the desperate fights, the feeling of being outmatched. But they also remembered how they had adapted, improved, and ultimately triumphed. The mockery they had endured had stung, but it had also motivated them to prove themselves. Commander David McCampbell, reflecting on his 34 victories, spoke about the evolution he had witnessed. In 1942, we were the underdogs, he said. We were flying inferior aircraft with inadequate training against an enemy that had every advantage. By 1945, the situation had completely reversed. We had the best aircraft, the best training, and the most combat experience. The Japanese went from predators to prey. It was a remarkable transformation, and it was built on the sacrifice of men who died in 1942, learning the lessons that kept me alive in 1945. The story of Japanese pilots mocking American fighters until their losses became unsustainable is ultimately a story about the dangers of complacency, the importance of adaptation, and the reality that wars are won not just by brave men, but by systems, institutions, and industrial capacity. The Japanese started the war with better pilots and better aircraft, but they failed to maintain that advantage. They did not adapt their training programs. They did not develop new tactics fast enough. They did not build aircraft that could compete with American developments. And perhaps most fatally, they did not recognize that the Americans they mocked in 1941 and 1942 were learning, growing, and preparing to turn the tables. The Pacific Air War demonstrated that initial advantages can evaporate quickly when facing an opponent with greater resources who is willing to learn from mistakes. The mockery that Japanese pilots directed at their American opponents in these early days of the war came back to haunt them as American pilots. Flying superior aircraft and using superior tactics dominated the skies. The hunters became the hunted. The mockers became the mocked. And in the end, the laughter died in the flames of 1,000 burning aircraft scattered across the Pacific. The veterans of both sides, those who survived to old age, eventually came to respect one another. Former enemies met at reunions, shared stories, and acknowledged the courage and skill that men on both sides had displayed. But they also acknowledged a truth that had been bought with blood. That confidence without the ability to adapt leads to defeat. That mockery of an opponent is a luxury that only the ultimately victorious can afford. And that in war, the side that learns faster often wins regardless of who holds the initial advantages. The empty chairs at those reunions, representing the thousands of pilots who never came home, stand as silent testimony to the cost of the transformation. American pilots who died in the early days, struggling against superior opponents. Japanese pilots who died in the later days, overwhelmed by enemies they had once dismissed. All of them victims of a war that should never have been fought. All of them paying the price for decisions made by leaders far from the cockpit. But their story remains, a chronicle of how pride became humility, how mockery became respect, and how the laughter of early victory gave way to the silence of ultimate defeat. The skies over the Pacific, once dominated by graceful Zeros flown by confident pilots who thought themselves invincible, ended the war filled with American aircraft flown by pilots who had earned their supremacy through sacrifice, adaptation, and an unrelenting commitment to learning from every mistake. The transformation was complete. The war was over, and the age of Japanese aerial dominance had ended, never to return. If you enjoyed this story, leave your like and subscribe to this channel. History has many more powerful stories to tell, and each one carries lessons that echo through the generations.